Right, y'all. It's another episode of Secret Skin, another one where I am what had happened was ing myself. I've had an amazing streak of getting incredible people who are the creators and elevators of awesome hip hop stories on here to talk to me about my little old albums. Today I have the privilege of being joined by Shawn Setaro. So just wanted to say first, Shawn, hello and thank you.
Hello, and thank you. I'm really honored to be on. It was a very pleasant surprise when Rob reached out and asked me if I was willing to do this.
Big shout to Rob. Rob is the editor for Secret Skin this season. He's done a great job, but he's also a couple of times now had a stroke of genius of asking a fantastic person if they wanted to come be a part of this. So we appreciate that. Before we get into the real subject of the conversation, which is the album I'm about to release, I did have a question for you. You have your book behind you, Dummy Boy, about Takashi 69. I know you've been following YNW Melly's story a lot. One thing I wanted to ask you in your endeavors, what is it that makes a hip hop story especially compelling to you?
I guess there's a couple levels to that. That's a really interesting question. The first is almost visceral, right? It's something that you can't look away from. And it has these sort of twists and turns that you're like, "Wait, that happened? He did that?" I think to take Takashi as an example, right? One of his gang members let out a shot and it was in an arena, like backstage at the Barclays, and then he went on Instagram and bragged about it like seconds later, just these,
Whoa,
yeah, stuff that gets that reaction, right? That
I
and the
see.
the woe doesn't have to be from like, outrageous crime. It can be from a twist or something interesting or whatever, but stuff that gets that, right? That I can't believe this happened. The stuff that has me like bothering everyone I know at dinner parties to be like, "You're not going to believe what I just found out." I did this endlessly while I was reporting the Takashi story. I'm sure everyone was sick of it who is around me. So that's one. The second part is it has to have some kind of resonance to the wider world. Often one I'm not even aware of at the beginning. Again, to take Takashi as an example, like there's a connection to what at the time was called SoundCloud rap, right? And how that was marketed and what audiences saw in that. And also, I think this was a story that only could have happened during the Trump years, right? And what does that say about politics in the wider world and how this guy, if I say, well, there's a guy who just, said outrageous things and the fan base loved that and they constantly made fun of opponents and picked on, the biggest people they could find and just endlessly went at them, am I talking about Takashi or Trump, right?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Like the underlying energy of trolling that was just in our world at that time. I
Exactly.
can see that being an easy avenue to get to the Takashi story. That's really interesting.
Again, sometimes I'm not even aware of these initial resonances and it's just the, wow, I can't believe that aspect. But often I find underneath there's another level as well. And also, honestly, some mysteries to uncover in that, to take Melly, there's a very central question at it. Like, did he commit these murders or not? And underneath that is a whole thing about, family and friends and what happens to a rap crew when all of a sudden there's big money involved and the guy who thinks he has the good ideas is not the guy getting all the money and attention, stuff like that.
It's been fascinating work, and it's interesting to hear you talk about it because I can see it so clearly now how these stories that are interesting on the surface, when you start scratching the surface, you start getting at all these other interesting layers of details. And you're right, that does make it fascinating. And I appreciate it too because it really sounds like it comes from a genuine, like journalistic sort of space, which is always something I'm wanting to have more of in hip hop, is a genuine sort of curiosity and like journalistic, integrity. So I just wanted to, shout out your work on that level before we turned it over to the subject of today's conversation, which is my new album, Component System with the Auto Reverse.
Well, first, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. It really means a lot that you're listening and paying attention to what I'm doing. So to start off, I want to take it back maybe 8 years. I was listening this morning to an old episode of this very podcast of Secret Skin, and you gave a long and great speech about underground hip hop and what destroyed it. I don't even know if you remember this, but
Had so many different theories over the years, so I'm not sure which one it was then.
so you said it was destroyed by two things: Napster style downloading, which is a whole discussion we can have at some point, but also by sample laws.
Yeah, for sure.
What you said was that by the time you got around to it, because of sample laws, you were trying to recreate the music of our youth, but with new restrictions.
True. 100%.
And I wanted to dig into that for a minute. What jumped to my mind was like, okay, what if the Beatles wanted to put their own spin on Elvis and Buddy Holly, but guitars were outlawed?
Right. Exactly.
Tell me about that idea because I've never really heard it put that way before.
Well, it just became apparent to me, especially after I talked to Prince Paul. And when I talked to him about the lawsuit around that first De La Soul album, you really got the sense of the lawlessness in which they went into the process of making that album. And at the time, that's one of the reasons the project was lauded, is because their ambition, where they were taking music from and trying to put this music together, was not where everybody else was looking. They were getting stuff like the Turtles, which is ultimately what they ended up getting sued for. And then also, even in talking to Dante Ross about it on the most recent season, because since Dante was working with Tommy Boy and he was part of the process in terms of what samples got cleared and what samples didn't, they were saying that on their end, they thought they only needed to clear the samples in the songs. They didn't think the interludes were going to be a big deal. And it also represents Tommy Boy's expectations of how the album would do. But this album comes out, and there's this story of the guy from the Turtles. Like, his daughter is listening to the De La Soul album, and he's like, "What is this?" And she says, "It's De La Soul." He's like, "No, that's my record." And then this thing ends up going to court and gets tied up in all this litigation. And between that and the Biz Markie lawsuit, I think it was Gary O'Sullivan, it really established the precedent that making music in this style is not legal. It's illegal. It has officially been called a crime by the courts, and punishments have been established. And I think it really changed how creators, hip hop creators, had to go about making music, especially if they wanted it to be successful. And I think this trickles into underground rap, because the labels that are putting out underground rap still don't want to be sued, even if their product is not for a mainstream audience. They're still wanting to avoid lawsuits, especially because the margins are so thin to begin with. It kind of pushes the entire genre in a different direction sonically, because people want to be able to have successful music careers. So I do think that, I think that changed the sound of the music a lot. I think because the reality of it for me is that most of my favorite albums couldn't be made today. Like, legally, they just wouldn't be able to be made. And that's just something I think about a lot when I'm listening to newer music and going back to older music. And there's a certain feeling that the older music gives me. And a lot of times it's harder to get that from new stuff, just in terms of the sonics that I appreciated the most.
There's obviously a lot there, but I want to move on to your record, right? So the full title of this record. Why don't you say it so that I don't mess it up? Give me the
Okay,
full title.
so this is the thing. The business title is Component System with the Auto Reverse,
But that's not what you call it.
right? Because it's got a fuller spiritual title, which is a tape called Component System with the Auto Reverse, recorded sometime in 1997. That's the full, real title of it in my heart.
And that's not a joke. That is an actual cassette tape, right? There was a mixtape called that you named Component System.
Yep.
So what was that tape? Was that the actual tape you were playing on IG the other day?
Yeah, that was the one. That was the one.
So there was like BCC and
Yeah, La Fleur La Flash Koshka's on there. Semi-Automatic, that Wu-Tang song. It's funny. I remember the songs. I remember this tape by the colors of the songs in my head more than I could tell you exactly the names of the songs that were on there.
was this one of your like taped off the radio cassettes?
Yes, but this was one that I used to call them all-star tapes. So I'd fall asleep taping the radio, you'd wake up and find out what you had and listen to that for a couple of weeks, and then you'd identify these are the best songs from this tape. And then these are the best songs. And then I would just make a tape of all the best songs off of all the tapes. And that tape was Component System.
Got it. I assume you had multiple of these, named cassette tapes. Why choose Component System particularly to name your album after?
Because I'm also evoking that stereo style the component system, like that look and that feel, and like the tactile way I used to press the stop button and the eject button and press the auto reverse and watch the tape loop and the CD changer come out. Like all of that is it's a visceral part of my memories of enjoying music at that time. And so I thought that name was especially fitting because I want to evoke that whole picture in the music that I'm making now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the story you're telling in this album, and you're very explicit about it. You know, this is my tribute to 96, 97, listening to the radio, taping stuff off the radio. I know you're someone who thinks a lot about marketing and narratives, right? Looking at the world, looking at your own music. So that's the story of this album. But what is part of this album that did not make it into the story of this album that you're sending out to people like me?
That's a great question. And I didn't necessarily know this at the time, but I've had a couple of conversations now about the album, and it's kind of emerged in my mind that there are narratives in this that aren't the narrative. One of them is so my last album's Anime Trauma and Divorce. You know, I moved out on my own February of 2020, and then a month later, we're in full worldwide lockdown. And the apartment I moved to was on Crenshaw and Homeland. That's the name of one of the songs on the album. What I didn't realize, because I moved out of that apartment a year ago this week. And so I was there for about a year and a half. And I made most of this album while I was living there. And what I've realized, and it's especially apparent in that song, Crenshaw and Homeland, that intersection was making me lose my mind. Together was fucking loud. It's telling me what to do. I lived across the street from a 7-Eleven, and I've learned, like globally, it feels like anything can happen in a 7-Eleven parking lot. There is no law enforcement. There's nobody there to stop anybody from doing anything ever. It is just constant chaos, even after the store is closed. And there was a mechanic that I lived next to, and they had so there's mechanic noises all day, and they had a dog that barked all night at nothing. There were car accidents on that corner all the time. There were shootings on that corner sometimes. There was a sect of Hebrew Israelites that would assemble on that corner every Saturday, and just the way that their loudspeaker was positioned, it went directly into my window.
Oh my
And for
God.
3 hours, I could hear nothing but them harassing people walking by. My goodness. And my stress level, my level of alertness, like I had not relaxed in a year and a half. And I think that's a big part of that album too. I think some of the urgency with which I'm rapping and writing is reflective of like feeling like I was in survival mode that entire time. And I think that's definitely a narrative in the album that's not put forward.
You mentioned Anime Trauma and Divorce. I would say, and in fact, you have said, I'm not getting this out of the air, that like the three albums leading up to this one, Dark Comedy, Brick Body Kids, and Anime Trauma and Divorce, have this arc of getting more personal, more personal, more personal. Why did this one go in the opposite direction?
I felt too vulnerable after Anime Trauma and Divorce. As much as it helped me to create that album, the process of putting it out as a business commodity was deeply uncomfortable for me. And I came out of it feeling very raw and very sensitive. And I wanted to separate my vulnerable self from the business again. I don't know if that's permanent, but certainly with this album, I wasn't as interested in putting that on display.
So have we reached the sort of peak introspection, or is there like maybe in the future you go further in that direction than your previous album?
I mean, I would say even on this one, where I do feel like I have a lot of armor on this album, I do think there's still some moments of me really plumbing the depths of my psyche and a little bit of my heart too on a few of the songs. So I do think I'll always have a little bit of that in my stuff. I don't know if I'm ever gonna completely put that forward again. I don't know if I will. I think I might have to get stronger in some ways before I try to do that again.
How do you mean?
There's a certain way in which you have to deal with your art as a product, as a creator, when you have to go out there and sell it. There's a certain distance I think you have to have from it in order to not read every YouTube comment or freak out at every review. And I wasn't able to have that with that last project because it was too personal. A review of it didn't feel like a review of an album. It felt like a review of me. I wasn't in a place where I had the resources to really like deal with that in a healthy way.
So this album, there is plenty of introspective stuff on it thematically and directly, but a lot of it's about rapping,
Yep.
about being impressive as a rapper, about trying to say, I am a great rapper. What kind of things impress you when you hear someone rap? Like, what are you listening for?
I'm a big sucker for rhymes. Rhymes I haven't heard, wordplay, energy, confidence, but the foundation for me is rhymes for sure. I want to hear the rhyme I haven't heard before cuz I've been the real hook for me for rapping when I first started in high school was like how many rhymes can I find in the English language? So, this many years in, anybody who can regularly come up with rhymes I haven't heard, like I'm there.
Will you ever repeat a rhyme? If you come up with something, will you be like, I used that 4 albums ago. I can't possibly rhyme these two words again?
I try not to do that, but I have done that by accident. What I've really become aware of is that oftentimes when I rhyme stuff on feature verses, I don't pay enough attention to whether or not I've used it before. So like a lot, like I'll hear a lot of features I didn't like. Oh man, I ended up using that same scheme on something else because I just didn't remember because it was a feature. So yeah, but I definitely avoid using stuff I've used on albums. I try to, but it happens.
And what is it about rhyming in particular? Like, I know you've given a lot of thought to this. Like, what is it about rhyming to unexpected things? How do you think about like the connection that creates between those two things?
A lot of times for me, it's about trying to find that connection and how to make that connection resonant with something for me. It hit me a long time ago when I was really getting into writing and listening to how other people wrote that all of us have the same words. And I think the interesting thing about what makes an MC special or unique is how they tailor those words to their persona. If you look at the way Eminem uses rhyming words, they are in support of a persona of Slim Shady who does certain things. If you look at cannabis, for instance, Redman, for instance, like we all have the same words. We're all using the same 2, 3 syllable patterns. And if ambitious, we, try to rhyme even more syllables. But at the end of the day, like the real thrill of it is finding the ones that support the character you have created. And I think, finding the meanings between those two rhyming words is about trying to find the way that it is resonant for me as Open Mike Eagle, the rap character. That to me is where the fascination starts, but it, goes real deep.
That's interesting. I just yesterday I was looking at an excerpt of one of Sondheim's books. Like he has collections of his lyrics, right? And his sort of commentary in there. And he has this one section where he just goes off on Lorenz Hart of Rodgers and Hart, really going after him. And he says one of his faults is sacrificing meaning for rhyme, like using a
Wow.
rhyming word, even though you get the meaning wrong, even though you're saying the wrong thing. Is that something you ever think about? How do you avoid it? Like, I guess I was just curious, as someone who uses so many rhymes, how do you think about making sense versus saying stuff that rhymes?
The thing about me is that I tend to always have something to say. So I'm never rhyming just to rhyme. There's usually some hypothesis or some thesis statement. There's something informing what I'm trying to say in a verse or in a bar. Even if I'm, like I said, I've tried to steer this back towards being more impressive, but even in that, I'm trying to say things that feel really real for me and use complex or interesting rhymes to do that. So I think in that doesn't end up being a problem for me because I think I know who I am as a writer. I think I know who I am as a character. And even but and the funny thing about that is who I am is the person who's always trying to figure out who he is. So there's a constant machinery there, but I think it ensures that I always have a purpose. And if I didn't have a purpose, then I think things would just sound like they were being rhymed for rhyme's sake. But I think because I do always at the end of the day have something I'm trying to say, that always comes before the rhymes.
In addition to rhyming, one other aspect of your style on this album that came out to me was like emphasis, was accents, the words you emphasize and what they bring out. And is that something you're conscious of? And do you ever kind of go through lines accenting different words, emphasizing different words, playing with that?
I can't say that I've ever consciously refined that, like, oh, let me go through and figure out how to say this word differently. But I do think in my writing process now, that's something I'm baking in to the writing now. Is like one of the ways to make this rhyme pattern or this punchline or this reference more interesting is to kind of bend it a little bit. But yeah, that typically is happening on the page. That's not really happening after the fact.
Mm. I don't know at what point sequencing came into this record for you, but I don't think it's an accident that the last voice you hear on this record is Diamond D.
It is absolutely not.
I wanted to ask why.
Because on the component system tape, and this didn't make the album, but the original component system tape, because I do have samples from that tape on the album. There's another portion where one of the DJs that you hear on the album from that tape, just randomly for no reason, starts going on and on about Diamond D. Because he randomly during that show played a Diamond D song that was maybe like 4 or 5 years old. And he was like, nobody's called and asked me this, but just so it'll be said. The reason I played that Diamond D song is because it's the best song in the studio. And then he starts talking about Diamond's new album he's got coming out. And it's just like Diamond D, his work, his beats, his music has just been a part of my creative life for so long that just it really means something in closing this loop and seeing how far I've come that I was able to work with him on this, not only with beats, but then to get a verse from him too. That felt really good to me. Whenever I listen to the album and I get to his verse and everything just cuts off right. Like that really feels like one of my old tapes because it's him.
You out frontin' with your boys tonight. Come on, fake Rolexes and moissanite. Ladies say the drip is ill, my voice is right. Pad is crazy, Spectre Rolls Royce is tight. Let's go, 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 go.
It's funny too because he still has that like DITC, Lord Finesse kind of like every bar's a joke style.
Yes, yes, yes. Set up punchline. I love it. I love it.
Amazing. This record, I know you wanted to have energy to feel, engaged, hungry. And, I know for you, where you first got that feeling was freestyling, right?
hmm
Being on the street, 100 people are listening to you battle somebody. How do you recreate this kind of like feeling of improvising to an audience when you're in a studio doing something composed by yourself?
Another aspect of the term component system and also with auto reverse, because auto reverse is my label, component system is also meant to describe the different collaborators that I've brought on for this thing. And so part of my answer to that question of energy is that I've been very intentional about inviting people into my workflow, inviting collaboration in a way that I hadn't before. I typically make all my albums completely alone. And if there's a verse on something, I've done the whole song and left the space and I've sent it to somebody and you get it back. But like this album specifically, I wanted the energy of being around other rappers. I wanted that to push my pen forward. And so a lot of these songs I made with people in the studio, and that is in response to what you're talking about. It's trying to invoke that energy.
Mm. So that brings me to Dave and Rift, who are, the most common collaborators. They're on about a quarter of the album. Talk about kind of your chemistry with the three of you.
It starts with the fact that I've known, like me and Rift, we went to high school together, and we literally rapped together for the first time. Like both of us, we used to go to this place called Promontory Point on the southeast side of Chicago. It was officially licensed Chicago Park District breakdancing class, but that attracted all the hip hoppers. So all the MCs used to go there too. So we used to just go there and just marvel at hip hop happening, and specifically standing outside of ciphers and watching amazing MCs just come off the head. And we listened and we listened and we listened and we would look at each other and we knew we wanted to do it. We'd talk about doing it. And then this one day, we had either just come from the point or we were just about to go. We went and get something to eat and we were at the back of a restaurant and we were sitting at the table and we were like, we're going to do this right now. So then we just started trying to put words together. It was the first time both of us had freestyle. It was awful, of course, because everybody starts off awful. But so my familiarity with him goes back all those years. And Dave I met in college, and we were part of the hip hop scene together down Southern Illinois University. And since he's moved to LA and we've started, doing our shows together. He does video at my shows. We started making more music together. But in both senses, there's a real like decades long familiarity that kind of informs our relationship to begin with. And then, I think we've kind of built the chemistry because we've just made a ton of songs together over the last 2 years. Like they've really like working with them has helped me survive the pandemic, like both in terms of like human contact, friendship, but also creativity. And so, I think we've really kind of found a groove in working with each other. Our chemistry is evolving more and more like every song we make.
It's interesting because that is part of, making the album, right? Is your friendship, but then also your friendship and the fact that they sort of brought you out of a dark place and helped you creatively is a theme on the record itself.
Yep, 100%.
I stay woke, I don't sleep great. I'm in a weird place creatively. And Dave and Riff keep saving me every Wednesday faithfully. But used to pop like turbo and said whatever till the world blow. And then the motherfucking world blew. I still got the same.
That gets to that narrative you were speaking on earlier. Like that corner was driving me crazy and I needed my friends to save me.
Amazing. This whole idea of taping songs off the radio, it's so interesting because you're taking something that was meant to be ephemeral, right? I mean, they may make tapes for, an archive or air check, but no one ever really listens to it. And a lot of times stations won't even do that. It's meant to be ephemeral. It's meant to be listened to once. And we had to tape it and preserve it. And it's just kind of a weird thing to do, right? And I guess I'm looking for your thoughts on that tension, right? And how it kind of informs this record.
What it's based on is so, okay, if I had been in love with mainstream hip hop, I might not have taped the radio because mainstream hip hop was on the radio all the time. And then they would end up playing the same songs over and over again anyway, so it wouldn't have been a need. The way that my interests were, I wanted this underground hip hop that there was no other way to get. I didn't have a lot of money, so I couldn't buy all the tapes at Coconuts or wherever, Dr. Wax in Chicago, like I wanted every tape that looked underground. I wanted it, but I couldn't afford it. So the way that I had to hear music was on these radio shows. And on the South Side, there were only 3 shows a week: Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday night on WHBK. And I couldn't stay up all night, especially on Wednesday, because that's a school night. So my only option in terms of like trying to get some new music to listen to, I was learning about the world of underground hip hop through these shows too, because they were playing stuff from New York, they're playing stuff from the Bay, they're playing stuff from LA, and I would get rap magazines and they might have a couple of pages on some underground stuff, but typically there was no other way to find it. So, it was important enough to me that I needed to capture these things. And then, yeah, so it kind of put me in a position where I had to capture it like a resource. Like I'd found the water source and I needed to put it in bottles. But but I think ultimately, yeah, it's just based on me wanting this thing that feels precious that I can't get everywhere. And it's funny, I never really thought about the fact that people don't do that. Like that never really occurred to me. Now I've had to talk about it a lot. And now like I have this box of tapes and I'm like, oh, it's weird that I have these things. Like that I still have them. Like, and I've lost plenty of them. They get broken, you moving, you lose things. It is strange, but that's also like the magic of that is kind of what I want to put on display too. Like I've had visions in my head of doing like installations where like I'm playing these tapes on all these boom boxes on the wall, like so, people can really feel it in a space. Because I think that there's a lot to mine from that weird behavior of like taping something that wasn't meant to be permanent in 1996 or 1997 and playing it to a room full of people in 2022 or 2023. There's going to be music in there that says a lot about how music gets to people, about what music still exists, about what music is important to who and why. And I think all those questions are really important and interesting to me too.
Yeah. Just one more quick thing before I get into some specific songs on the record, which is like, you're talking about 96, 97, you're talking about underground rap. And one of the things that struck me about that time versus getting a little older and meeting some of the people who were active then is I feel like the fans had a very, very hardcore, you're on this side or that side of the wall.
The dichotomy, yeah.
Yeah. And before I put my experiences, I'm curious what you think now that, presumably you've met many of the people who were actually making music at that period. How did they feel did they have that same kind of almost purist mentality that their listeners did?
I haven't talked to a lot of people about it, but I do think that there's an understanding now that people who were fans, people who were consuming the music, I think most of us now have an understanding that a lot of that was just marketing. There wasn't a lot of artists openly saying that I am underground and that mainstream stuff is fake. I mean, there was certainly a lot of like allusions to the stuff that people used to do in music videos being whack, like renting fake houses and all of that. Like there was certainly a lot of criticism of fronting, but there wasn't a lot of, oh, that artist is garbage because they make mainstream music. Somehow, like we talked ourselves into that a lot. And I do think that there was a lot of media and record label narrative pushing that kind of like us having those conversations and feeling that way was helpful for them. But one of my earliest memories, I went to some show, I think it was like a Spit Kicker tour or something in like 99 or 2000. And Mos Def, when he was still called Mos Def, was on stage. He was either about to perform or he was hosting. And the DJ played a DMX song. And a bunch of people in the audience started booing. He was like, nah, no, we're the same. He was like, don't do that. Like, we're the same. And I understand that now because I understand that DMX had been an MC in New York forever, had been underground, had been an artist, had been rhyming. Like he took rhyming as a craft more seriously than we did. We called ourselves taking it seriously, but we were living with our mothers, and going to school and having, just it was a hobby for us. But for DMX, he was like homeless, rapping for his life, like and just because he happened to become very successful at that didn't make him any less of an artist. And I just think a lot of us ultimately had to find our way to some level of maturity about that. Although there are still pockets of people who have that old dichotomy.
Yeah, it's funny. I just remember like first encountering some people who are kind of in that like extended raucous universe or whatever, and expected them to be like, fuck Puff, whatever. And they're like, no, I saw Puffy every week at Daddy's house, whatever. Like
Right.
just because the scene was comparatively small, so there weren't these divisions among people who were going out to experience it every week.
Right. And even, when I was talking to Dante and, he was there to watch the whole thing develop. And it was funny to hear. It was kind of weird for him to see the dichotomy because at one time it was just the hip hop business and people were doing it different ways, but it wasn't this sharp division between how a glossier act was doing it versus how a more street act was doing it. Like everybody was just in the music business. That story is endlessly fascinating for me. I have a lot to say about it, but that will probably get us off track.
One more thing about marketing. I know you're a huge They Might Be Giants fan.
One of the biggest.
Beyond the music, one of the things that made them stood out, my wife is a giant fan of theirs. Obviously I've been aware of them a ton over the years, is their marketing, right? Is the unique things they would do, the dial a song or the CD of the month club, stuff like that they did over the years.
They might be giants, dial a song, not too short and not too long. Every time I sing along to They Might Be Giants, dial a song.
Did you take any inspiration from that?
It's funny. Now that you say that, I realize I haven't taken enough inspiration from that. I have not put enough of my creativity into new ideas about how to reach people. I think that has something to say towards the size of my fan base too. I think that that's maybe one area where I could improve. I'll say that.
So I wanted to get into, a bunch of the specific songs here. And the very first thing you hear on this record, on the song with the secret name, is this very long string of rhyming the same sounds. And you change the sounds gradually over the course of the scheme, but there's like 10 or 11, uses of this scheme before you change it entirely.
1, 2, 1, 2. Reform with Bill Cartwright. shit's real like the arc light. Do cartwheels on the dark side. The vibe feels like apartheid. Running till I drop like the far side. My heart locked in the archive. The car's blocked as a rock slide. A large drop of peroxide. Belly full of hot lies. Spinning quill like Chris's Popeye. My head hard like the top of a pot pie. Be a fake king.
What's the purpose of putting that right up front in the song?
I would not say that that was done with a front brain intention. I would say that this is one of the first songs I wrote when I realized what kind of songs I wanted to write for this album. There's a feeling to the pocket that I'm in on that beat, which is so unorthodox. And I was so excited to kind of find a way to rhyme the words I wanted to rhyme, but in a way that wasn't expected on that beat, that feeling is what I wanted to put forward. Like, this is me, but this is me doing something different. And I think that beat is just a really good kind of triumphant open the door type beat too.
Yeah. And one of the rhymes that stood out to me on that is use the word grimoire, right? I wrote the bars in the grimoire. And so that brings up all these associations of rhyming as a kind of spell, a kind of magic.
It's like Pac rocking with John B. The connection's beyond me. Close like your mom to your auntie. A bust to the split star. No doubt that it hit hard. I wrote the bars in the grimoire. I broke it down like a foot fracture.
And I guess I kind of just wanted to get your feedback to that. Was that like, why use that word? Were you trying to get those associations? Was it just kind of a fun word that, had a similar vowel sound? Like, why grimoire?
So interesting you ask that. And I'm going to give you the gold star because, and you haven't even done it on purpose, but you have uncovered one of the secret names of the song. The song has two secret names. Nobody has I'm sitting here like, when is somebody going to ask me what the secret name of the song is? It has got two secret names, and one of the secret names is Grimoire. And there was an intention to writing something that felt like a spell. And I think there's been a lot of my writing that I've felt is that there's a lot of songs I do live that to me definitely take on the feeling of like an incantation, like you're trying to bring everybody to a certain energy. And I like any references that really point at the power of a rap verse in that way, or a rap song in that way.
Are you willing to say the other secret name?
Sure, I'll tell you.
All right. Just between us.
The other secret name, and there's a reason I felt like I needed to call the song with the secret name. It wasn't to hide the name. It's just that, and once you hear the second name, I think you'll understand why. The second name of this song is "The Day Rory and Mal Got Fired." That's the second secret name of the song, because that's the day I wrote it. And that was another thing about the energy of the song. In that Joe Budden podcast episode where he came on just like, and remind you, I'm in that apartment on Crenshaw and Homeland losing my mind. There was some energy to that like it went in me and I had to get it out. And that's part of how I was writing too.
Rory, you are in breach of your contract. And from this point forward, you are fired.
And the song used to have a hook that was referencing that, not directly. But of course, like, I don't want to have that printed on the album because that makes it sound like it's clout chasing or something crazy like that. And that's not the point. The point was like, this is what has informed this song. Because that's the fun thing about titling songs for me, is to try to identify what energies informed the song. And that was the initial energy, was that day.
Gotcha. And so you have the intro next. Intro comes second, of course. TDK scribbled intro.
I was thinking about all the stuff I said before. Sitting by myself. My insides was out. Felt weird. Sitting by myself. Yesterday is safer, cause you already know what happened. I had some time by myself. And every album, everyone is a little collection of pieces of yesterdays. I don't always have the words for the feelings. Sitting by myself. So I decided to make you a tape.
What's the most embarrassing song you ever put on a mixtape for a crush?
The Crystal Ship from The Doors.
What was the thinking behind that?
Her name was Crystal.
Amazing.
And I thought she would think that was cute. She didn't care at all. It was like, oh, yeah, okay, right. This whole thing was a mistake.
Thanks for watching that, and if you dug that, leave a thumbs up and say what up in the comments, and make sure to subscribe to Stony Island Audio for more.